Hello, I'm Fiona Saville, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at Better Start Bradford. And I'd like to welcome you all to the Community Engagement and COVID-19 Impact Response and Recovery webinar. It's so great that so many of you are passionate, just like us, about community engagement, and we've got an excellent lineup of speakers for you this afternoon. So our first speaker is Zara Niazi. She is the Programme Lead for Bradford Council on the Integration Strategy Communities Programme, which is Bradford for Everyone. I've had the pleasure of working with Zara in the past, and I just think she's incredible. But she's done a number of things which have included being a Trust Governor for the Bradford District Care NHS Foundation Trust, and she's also a Director at the Bradford Impact Hub as well. So without further ado, over to our first speaker, Zara Niazi.
What a lovely introduction that was. I'm absolutely delighted to come back and speak to people at Better Start. I'm going to be speaking about our response as a council and a district around COVID-19. So most people will certainly know the council's long-standing work around and commitment to equalities and diversity. We've been hit by austerity obviously for many years now, and over the last few years, Stronger Communities definitely has been one of the areas which has been massively impacting living very little resource. We're quite unfortunate actually that in 2018 we were asked to become an integration area, and that led us to develop a strategy in response to the government's integration strategy green paper. And as part of our commitment to diversity, we became an intercultural cities in November 2018, which is the Council of Europe's flagship programme, enabling us to benchmark our approach to diversity as a district against 130 cities worldwide. In March 2019, we became an integration area officially to test and learn from a range of activities to help us build a case for integration, about what works and what doesn't over the next 2 years. And as Fiona mentioned, our programme runs under Bradford for Everyone and delivers against those strategy objectives. Our work largely focuses on 4 priority areas. One is around getting on, which is about employment, access to opportunity, ESOL, supporting new arrivals that come into the district, getting along, which is about cohesion and social interaction between different people, getting involved, which is about civic participation and volunteering and strengthening leadership, and feeling safe, which is about hate crime and tackling rumours and misconceptions. It includes a range of 40 projects, lots of research, and obviously some in-campaign activity in there as well. The programme really complements and builds on our Stronger Communities work on community reassurance and engagement, celebrating, commemorating the significance. People Can, which was the main face of our COVID-19 response, faith tours, EU settlement scheme, and our VCS infrastructure support. In terms of our response, or our collective response to how we went out and worked with COVID-19, was the first probably point to make is that it was quite a collective response made up of VCS partners, housing associations, fire service, and the police. And many people were deployed actually from very different roles. So, you know, we were in a completely different world. Organisations were stepping up. We were working in ways that was really fast paced and mobilising services in such a short amount of time. The council response to work around COVID-19 was around these 5 particular themes. And we also developed a kind of a gold command structure and a silver group as well within that. While some really amazing work has happened across these themes, for example, around vulnerable adults and health, I am going to be talking about specifically around theme 2. So our priorities within this particular theme really was to look at 5 different areas. The first was really looking at volunteer coordination, and this work was predominantly carried out within our virtual area hubs. And I'll talk about them in a second. Volunteers were also recruited from 2 main sources. One was our web forms, which were hosted by partners, and our 431,000 phone number, specific call line that we set up for people to ring in to asking for support. Within 4 weeks, we had an incredible response. We had over 1,500 people who wanted to volunteer and give up their time, which is actually phenomenal. Recruited volunteer coordinators for each area hub, and they were particularly existing VCS organisations as well. And we built up relationships within that in terms of the cohort of volunteers that each of them were assigned to. Volunteers kind of did a whole range of different activities, including shopping for shielding people and people who were self-isolating, befriending initiatives, making face masks, supporting care homes, and providing reassurance and engagement in communities. The second and third kind of objective was more around thinking about the sort of monitoring tensions that might fall out of COVID-19, especially around things like, the rumours and conspiracy theorists that were actually, available on social media. And so part of that was thinking about also our communications, was to make sure that we're providing that reassurance, engaging with communities, no matter what their background, where they were from, just around things like, Ramadan and Eid celebrations, preparations, face masks and coverings, and the test and trace programme as well. And we did a whole range of things on social media, newspaper, WhatsApp groups, radio, and we did a lot of sort of face-to-face engagement where our youth workers went out, imams, medical professionals as well, developed audio and videos as well that could be put up online and could be shared by organisations just to reinforce those COVID-19 messages. And then along with that, we did lots of what we call community resilience walks, where volunteers and wardens went out to really just cascade the key messages into communities. And they did that with leaflets and just information and just talking to people over their garden fence, which I think, was really, really important to do for people who we couldn't really reach. And then sort of looking at the fourth objective was really around looking at food supply, especially for those people that found themselves to be more vulnerable as a result of COVID. And so we set up a central food distribution centre, which was mobilised at the Broadway Centre. And that provided basically food parcels for the 8,000 people that were on the government shielding list, but also people who were in that immediate financial hardship. And along with that, we also worked with a number of food providers in terms of food banks and looking at soup kitchens, just to make sure that they could, and people could continue accessing that food supply and could continue to be fed. The last bit really is around the mobilisation of the hubs and centres across the district, which were really there to deploy the volunteer coordination and also look at support services and social isolation services. So we set up 5 base hubs across each constituency. And then underneath that, we had a number of neighbourhood centres in each ward. So some areas had more than one neighbourhood centre, some had 3, 4, depending on the organisation. And with that, we really funnelled all the work through the 431,000 number and through each constituency hub, making sure that support were given to those people that were self-isolating and needed our support. In terms of the short time that we've had, we obviously mobilised a whole operation, which is fairly impressive. And in saying that, lots of local authorities across the district were doing similar things. And we did a little bit of talking to those local authorities about what they were doing, what they were learning, and what the challenges were, so we could just learn from each other as well, even considering how rapid we were kind of moving. But in saying that, even though we've got all these wonderful figures on the screen, there was actually so much else happening in the district, which is really actually impossible for us to quantify. We had residents, organisations just going out, giving out food parcels, etc. So I think just recognising that it was a very much a collective effort. And I think the thing that I want to say is that actually people demonstrated a whole lot of kindness and compassion of this period of time, just in terms of like things like giving out cakes and entertainment for people who were in care homes, or just having those regular garden gate conversations with people who were young or vulnerable. And I think that just shows kind of the spirit really in terms of how we kind of approached this. Along with that, we also designed the befriending platform, which we're hoping to kind of roll out and scale. But basically, the befriending platform was something quite new and innovative to address the high level of people who are socially isolating. Now we've reached achieved a phenomenal amount of things just in terms of building new connections, existing networks, just new ways of working across organizational boundaries and around a really important common purpose. So what we've learned, and I'm just thinking about 6 key areas which I think are really just important to highlight. The first really is about cutting out all the red tape. I think just having to respond around a crisis like this has enabled all organisations, no matter what their structure looks like, to come together and to respond for that. So you haven't got those hierarchical issues, and everybody, no matter what their job is, suddenly they're pitching in. And I think that was just really a key thing, that we could and can mobilise when we need to, when crisis happens. The depth of knowledge in terms of local area was really important. I think we were able to move at the pace that we did because we had those local connections already within the communities. The third element is actually having the workforce, because they represented the communities themselves. They were from those communities. It actually allowed us to have a much more quicker response. It saved time in terms of translations, and it allowed us to kind of build those, trust and confidence within that engagement as well. The other thing that really helped and what we learned is just in terms of people being deployed into different roles. Wardens carried out a huge amount of practical tasks, which is not in their general job description, but they were doing things like collecting newspapers and prescriptions and putting money on fuel cards for people who couldn't have access to electricity. And they were delivering also things like activity packs and books. The fire service also were really important. I mean, they completely stepped down and deployed into things like delivering medication for those people who were very vulnerable. And the fact that even with all the guidelines and the social distancing rules, the fact that we were still able to engage with people face to face was actually really important in terms of making sure those key messages were out there in terms of communication. And I think the huge amount of work that public health did in terms of the behavioural science they brought into communications was really helpful in terms of just making sure that our messaging was right and it was consistent. And I think that was just really sort of the key, for me, what was the key things that came out of that. Obviously, government's view is that we should try to get back to some level of normality as quick as possible. But obviously, we know that our world has massively changed. And as a result, we're having to significantly change our approach in the delivery of our services. And the way that we do things in terms of activities. And we also know that different cities have different rates of infection, and as such we're going to have to respond differently locally. But the difference between the local and national communication messaging shows that, especially within our conversations, how confusing it is for people. And also we can't even keep up with the pace of the rumours and conspiracy theories that are out there. And that's all very working in a challenging environment. We've evolved the group, the bronze level group, to a community resilience group. However, we need to really continue to consider all of the options and scenarios that we might be facing in the next couple of months and even years to continue to respond to that in a local way. So my last slide is really just thinking about the emerging themes that are coming out. My kind of first 3 things that we are really having to focus on now is around social distancing, because there are national guidelines that have changed. We have to think about what that means for us locally, and we're finding that quite challenging to do. There has been a spike just across the country, really, in terms of domestic abuse. That is obviously a huge concern to us as well. And so we are putting lots of mechanisms around that to make sure people who are experiencing domestic abuse and their families are receiving the support that they need. There's also a concern around people who have become newly poor. So people who've been furloughed, people who've lost their jobs in terms of 0-hour contracts, all of that, the impact that has on people's lives. And so we have, just for instance, thinking about a solution, we have been working with the Bradford Credit Union about putting a new sort of loan in place that helps divert people from accessing high interest loans and avoiding payday lenders as well. But something like this could be really scalable if it works. More worrying for me, I think, is more around the long-term impact around COVID-19, and some of the themes here are actually a reflection of what's happening nationally, especially across the all parliamentary group on social cohesion. So for us, there is an element looking at social justice. I think more and more the data and the emerging soft intelligence is telling us that COVID has increased the gap on inequalities more and more. Social justice is becoming more and more critical and important. Mental health, of course, is massively increasing and is a concern and will be for many years as a result of social isolation. And also there's some raised concerns about digital inclusion, because we know that as a result of COVID. I mean, we're doing a webinar right now online, just an example of how we have changed. We would have normally done this in a conference hall. But there are sections in our community we know that aren't able to do things online because either they can't afford the technology or the data, or don't have access to the skills, for example. And so we know that's an issue. Smaller voluntary community organisations, of course, will have some issues around having the support around their infrastructure to transform the services. So again, smaller organisations can't go online, can't adjust their practice to be able to continue serving the community. And community relations on top of that is absolutely important as well. We know early trends are showing there's a unifying effect that's happened very early in parts of COVID, and we've seen that in Bradford as well. However, there's also evidence of more localised community tensions really associated with these kind of negative perceptions that have been coming out. And there are some reports, obviously, some of these groups, extremist groups, people who are actually using these tensions as a way to advance their agendas. And that's led to an increase in racist and xenophobic behaviour, and we've seen that in terms of hate crime data in Bradford. So in terms of what do we need to really consider in terms of the future? So we know that the divisions between rich and poor are really stark in terms of experience, but and we also know that people who've experienced COVID more significantly have been people who are from poorer backgrounds. And we also know from a volunteer response that communities have felt more united as well. But we need to recognise, I guess, as well, how important social connection is in all of that for our own well-being and society as a whole. So I just wanted to lastly touch on a key thing around integration and cohesion, just being really a key sort of fundamental component to building happier, stronger, active and healthy communities. We can't address inequalities without exploring the systems in which we operate, the structural systems that exist and discriminate people. We need to think about our own privilege within that, our unconscious bias, which can impact on opportunities for other people. And we recently heard about Black Lives Matters and the death of George Floyd. And I think it's important that I mention that because this is the context that we're in. And that if we are talking about health inequalities, we're also addressing some of these issues. So my top 3 tips, if I just leave this with you, is that we should, if anything, from this presentation, is that we need to raise awareness around social justice, talk about wealth, we're talking about opportunities and privilege. And, we are thinking about that because without that, we continue to aid things like segregation and polarisation of communities. Be an ally. That would be my second tip, is to educate ourselves and others, just recognise how important it is, not just for our communities, but also for our workforce, about having those difficult conversations, building our skill sets, and just making sure that we're building and contributing towards building a fairer, more compassionate and kinder society. And the last thing is about challenging structures. Please do, because we really need to think about who we are inviting around the table. And we need to be thinking about partners being from all backgrounds and especially our communities. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Zara. That was amazing. I wouldn't expect anything else. I think lots of what you said there resonated with so many of us. And what you were saying about the kindness and the compassion of the community, how we all had to work at such a fast pace to to mobilise services and to be responsive to what our communities needed. So thank you for that, Zara. I'm now going to introduce our second speaker, Pippa Bird. So Pippa is a public health registrar. She's currently working on the Reducing Health Inequalities with West Yorkshire Harrogate Health and Care Partnership. And during COVID, Pippa has been working with Bradford Council to understand groups that are vulnerable to the impact of the epidemic. Prior to this, Pippa was the Principal Research Fellow at Born in Bradford, as some of you may already know, and it's over to Pippa.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. So thanks for the introduction. Today I'm going to present some work that I've done over the last few months in collaboration with the CSAG, so the COVID Scientific Advisory Group, and also the Bradford Public Health team, to understand groups in society, and in Bradford in particular, who are particularly vulnerable to the wider health, social and economic impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. So at the start of the pandemic, there was a lot of focus on groups who are particularly vulnerable to COVID itself, groups who are clinically vulnerable, people who had underlying health conditions, people who are older, people who are pregnant, people who needed to shield. But it became apparent quite quickly that the control measures that had been put in place were also having indirect impacts on people's health, economic and social well-being. So the indirect impacts included, for example, impacts on employment, on income, financial security in general, education, child development, social isolation, loneliness, health-related behaviours, access to healthcare. So as a result of this in Bradford, we started some work to understand who is most vulnerable to these wider impacts, these indirect impacts as a result of the crisis. So my job really was to define the key groups and also to quantify them and look at how we can better understand this vulnerability to shape services in our region. So if we first think about who's most vulnerable to COVID-19, I think we're all quite familiar with these groups. So the most vulnerable groups are the shielded groups, and they've been defined by the government. So they include, for example, people with specific cancers, people who've had organ transplants. Then we have a group of people who have clinical vulnerabilities, older people, pregnant women, for example. But over time, it's also become increasingly apparent that there are people who have a greater risk of infection or worse outcomes. So for example, people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, people living in deprived areas. But when we look at who's most vulnerable to the wider impacts, so the health, social and economic impacts, the picture's a lot more complex. So what we did was we looked at scientific literature, and we also engaged in consultations with different stakeholders in Bradford to try and understand which groups have particular vulnerabilities to these indirect impacts. And we identified a list of groups that grew very fast, and we categorized these groups into 4 key categories. So firstly, groups who are at risk of poverty and have insecure employment. So that would include, for example, households in the most deprived areas, children who are living in poverty, households with food poverty or insecurity, people who are self-employed in their households at particular risk of financial insecurity, people who have precarious employment or people who work in the gig economy, and of course people who've lost their jobs as a result of COVID. Secondly, we identified a category of people who had underlying health conditions or disabilities that created additional risks for them. So that included people with long-term health conditions, physical disabilities and communication difficulties. People with autism and learning disabilities was a really key category, and children with autism and learning disabilities we found have suffered increased impact of the lockdown and increased impact of schools closing, for example. People with underlying mental health conditions, people with addictions, and as well, and very importantly, people who have unpaid caring responsibilities. And we know that that group has grown considerably during the COVID crisis. Thirdly, we identified people with protected characteristics. So these are the traditional groups that are listed as part of the Equality Act. So we would include people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, recent migrants and asylum seekers, people from Central and Eastern European countries who may, for example, suffer access barriers to healthcare services, have language barriers, people from Roma and traveller communities, pregnant women, new parents, and LGBT communities. And then finally, we had a sort of a catch-all group of other important groups that came up during that consultation. So that included people with housing needs or who are homeless. People who lived alone came up as a really key group, especially people who are older and who lived alone. Lone parents who really struggled with juggling the increased need for childcare and work. People who are digitally excluded, again, a really, really key group, and very diverse group. So we had children who are digitally excluded and are unable to take part in education, but also a lot of older people who are digitally excluded and suffered loneliness. People at risk of violence and abuse, and some other categories. But this is a very simple typology, and there are a number of key considerations that we need to take into account. So firstly, when lockdown started, it was a very rapidly changing environment. There were large and rapid social changes. And so we knew that the groups that we'd listed probably aren't complete, will change over time, and also the number of people in each group will change over time. Secondly, we've presented them as distinct groups, but we know in reality they overlap. And it's the people who experience multiple vulnerabilities who are likely to be at greatest risk of negative health, economic and social impacts. So an example might be someone who has a pre-existing mental health condition and also loses their job or has insecure employment. We know that there are inequalities within each of these groups, for example, by gender or ethnicity. And a really key one, and in particular for Better Start Bradford work, is that there are other members in the household for all of these groups. So for all of the groups that I've gone through, there may be children in the household, for example, and they're likely to also face additional needs because of other members in their household. And then finally, an important one is that this has a fairly negative connotation. It takes an approach looking a little bit at deficits, but it's important to understand that there are structural drivers of all of these vulnerabilities. These are caused by wider society and the changes that are happening as a result of the control measures for COVID. And it's also important to take into account the wide variety of community assets that we have in Bradford and all of these positive components of communities in Bradford as well. So our next step was that we started quantifying and mapping each of these groups. So we looked at how many people there are within Bradford in each of the groups we've listed, and where possible, we looked at how they were located across the district. So I think everyone's quite familiar with this kind of map. It's a map of where the low-income households are in Bradford, and as you can see, they're particularly concentrated around the city, inner city areas. But the different groups that we looked at had slightly different distributions. So if we look at lone parent households, for example, we see a slightly different pattern. And if we look at where single person elderly households are located, we get a very different pattern, with older single person households located predominantly in rural areas in our district. So the next step following this was to look at what are the needs of each of these groups. And we built on theory on need, specifically Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and looked at how this needs to be adapted for the current context. And using that, we developed 6 key categories of need. So the first is basic needs: food, housing, money. Second is safety, so everyone needs safety from violence and a secure living environment. Third is health. So people, everyone needs access to healthcare, physical and mental health, preventive care, opportunity and support to maintain healthy behaviours. The fourth is psychological and well-being, so mental well-being, social well-being. People need support, and again, they need opportunity to engage in healthy behaviours. Fifth is social. So everyone needs opportunities to have social contact, friendship, peer support. And a lot of those opportunities were cut off during the lockdown. And then sixth, we looked at education and development. And importantly there, we included early childhood development, which we felt was a bit neglected earlier on during the pandemic response. So we felt that children needed opportunity to engage in education, but of course also opportunity to engage in play and the materials and resources to do that. There's been a lot of discussion about the timing of impacts, and this graph has been widely shared, showing early on, following the outbreak starting, we had waves of immediate mortality and ill health. But if you look at the fourth wave, we see an increased impact over time. And I think that's probably true, but I think based on our knowledge from Bradford, we could probably adapt this graph a little bit. We have seen very immediate economic, social and health impacts as a result of COVID control measures, and in particular for families and children. So I mentioned before that it's important not just to look at vulnerabilities, but also to take into account all of the positives that are going on in Bradford. It's been amazing working in Bradford because there's just so much going on. Very, very active work across the voluntary and community sector. So much going on that we just couldn't get our heads around the sheer scale and different initiatives that have taken place. Lots of work in the local authority, as Zara outlined, and also the NHS organisations. So we just tried to capture some of that because these assets and opportunities can be built on to provide support for the most vulnerable groups. So they include the fantastic places that we have in Bradford, our green spaces, our galleries, our heritage buildings, the institutions that we have, particular services and initiatives, organisations, and our communities and particular community champions that we have in Bradford. So finally, just to finish off, after we'd identified groups that suffer disproportionate risk as a result of COVID in the response, we wanted to look at how can we build on this to think about what further support is required. So we developed a framework together. So the framework is that firstly, you take a particular population group that's particularly vulnerable. Second, you outline what the particular needs and impacts are, and we can use the 6 categories in our framework for that, looking at both short-term and medium and long-term needs. Third, we can do a sort of a gap analysis, essentially, so looking at what support is already in place, and are there any particular gaps? So are there gaps for population groups or particular needs that we feel aren't being met? So for example, at the start of the crisis, there was a lot of support given in terms of meeting basic needs, providing food, financial security, but some of the mental health and well-being and education development needs were perhaps not being met so well. So were there opportunities there and gaps that were being missed? And then finally, we looked at options for further support, drawing on work across the region, literature, and just consultation with stakeholders across Bradford. So we developed the framework as a tool for groups to use in Bradford, and we started having a go at using it for the categories and the groups that we'd identified. But as I mentioned, there's so much going on in Bradford that we knew that what we were doing was a very partial picture. So I'm going to present this very messy slide, but I won't go through it all, just as an example of how we did that mapping exercise. So we looked at children living in low-income households, the particular needs that they're facing as a result of the COVID crisis. We mapped some of the support available, but we're sure this doesn't capture everything that's going on in Bradford because there's so much. And looked at further actions that could be taken based on things that are happening in other areas and suggestions from stakeholders that we spoke to. And we've done this for all population groups, but what we've suggested in the report is that this framework could be taken away and used by organisations across the city to make sure they're meeting the needs of the most vulnerable groups in society. So just to conclude now, there are a wide range of population groups that are particularly vulnerable to disproportionate wider health, social and economic impacts. And it's really important to think that there are other members in the household, including children, that are likely to have additional needs as a result of this. There's a lot going on in Bradford, and the voluntary and community sector organisations, including Better Start, have played a really pivotal role in providing support. The framework is now being used by different sectors in Bradford to understand the needs of vulnerable groups and to make sure that they're providing appropriate support. And we have recommended as well that impact be monitored throughout the recovery period to make sure that needs are being met. And that's it, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Pippa. That was great. Thanks for sharing such detailed research. And again, just so many messages there that I'm sure we can all relate to. I think one thing that you said there that I'm going to hold on to probably for the rest of this month is all of the positive that's going on in Bradford, and I'm sure we'll all agree with that. Everyone's been busy. There's been a call to action, and we've all just got in there and just stuck together and yeah, just worked through this. So we're going to move on to our next presentation now, and this presentation is Jill Thornton from Better Start Bradford. So she's our head of programme. And during COVID-19, Better Start have continued to work with our commission projects and partners to ensure that needs identified and parents and children are reached. I'm also going to join Jill in presenting some of these slides, so bear with me. And Jill, it's over to you.
So what I'm going to do is a little bit of background of our Better Start Bradford programme, because we've got nearly 90 people here in the room, and some of you won't know about us. Hopefully a lot of you will know about us because we work directly with you. And it's been a really brilliant webinar so far. I've really enjoyed listening to some of the things that have been said, but what struck me particularly is how common the themes are, how much we all agree with each other about what's happened during COVID, what the impact has been, and also how we've perceived the needs. Pippa has been doing the research that she's been doing, and that's really interesting, and we will definitely be taking that forward. But actually, through our work with our communities and talking to families and our engagement work with our excellent engagement team, we've kind of picked up all the same things. So it's interesting, and we've started to respond to them. So some of the actions that Pippa had suggested in the framework that they've designed, we've already started to do. Fiona will tell you a little bit more about those things and some of our responses. But it's heartening to know that through the engagement work that we're doing, we are in touch with what's actually happening on the ground and working closely with our partners to respond to what's going on. Anyway, I'm just going to start the presentation, share a couple of slides with you, and then Fiona will take over and she'll talk you through what we've been doing in Better Start Bradford in terms of our COVID response, and also what we're thinking of doing next and what we think is a priority. Right, so that's me, and this is Better Start Bradford, and today is the 29th of July, and I'm really glad you're all here. So Better Start Bradford, as many of you will know, is a successful lottery fund bid that we made 5 years ago now for a 10-year prevention and early intervention programme. We were awarded £49 million, which is a significant amount of money to bring into Bradford to try to improve and to prevent harm to children in the very early years, and to support parents in the community. And parents in the community have been at the centre of our partnership and our programme right from the beginning. So more than half of our partnership board, which oversees the programme and is our strategic governance, is made up of local people, local parents and people from the community. And they're working alongside system leads to drive this programme on an equal footing and with an equal voice. And that's really important to us. But as Fiona will expand on, we've got people and parents from the community involved in our programme at every level. And that was always one of the driving forces for our programme. And of course, the obvious reason for that is because you can't get a programme like ours to work unless people are part of it and are helping to make the decisions and to drive the programme. It was designed by the lottery as a test and learn programme, which means that we're in a position where we can try things out and learn from them, and that helps us to think about how things can change across the district in terms of early intervention and prevention, and reform of services to provide better for those important people in the very early part of their life. And as you will all know, that's the time when really the foundations are set for a person's life. And so it's really critical that we get it right in those early years. And working with Born in Bradford, who are our evaluation partner, where we developed a programme that's based on the best available evidence in science, and is adding to the evidence base for what works in improving maternal and child health, and which leads to improved school readiness. Our key outcome areas are social and emotional development of our children, improving language and communications, and looking at food and nutrition with a focus on preventing obesity. And there's been a lot of talk about obesity recently, but of course, once again, the obesity starts in childhood very often for people, and if we can prevent obesity in the early years and in early childhood, then we're helping to improve health throughout a person's life. And just a key point to make, that it's focused on pregnant women and children aged 0 to 3, because this is a window of opportunity. We're now 5 years in. We've delivered a lot of services. We've had a lot of contact with people. We've involved a lot of members of the community. And we're beginning to understand the answers to some of those questions that we were asking early on. But the focus for today is about how we've done community engagement, how that's worked, and how it's helped us to respond to the COVID-19 situation. Just to say a little bit more about our community engagement. So we've got a community engagement strategy, and our board have taken the lead on this and decided that we should have community engagement as a golden thread that runs throughout our entire programme, because it's not just about what our engagement team do when they're going out and working with parents in their groups and in their communities. It's what we all do. So all of our 20 projects are responsible for making our engagement work and to responding to the things that parents and the people in the community require, and have a relationship with them through the services that they're providing. It's about the neighbourhoods that we work in and how we work with them, and particularly with our Better Place project, how we help to improve those neighbourhoods for the benefit of our 0 to 3s. And it's about how we as individuals see our responsibility and our accountability to our parents and to the community that we're working for. Our engagement strategy also is focused on understanding how the increased inequalities that people in our area experience, and we're expecting that to become worse or to become more acute through the COVID experience, how that increases the importance of empowering the community. Because as Pippa has referenced, the assets that are in the community are a key part of supporting families and helping them to reach the same level as other people across our district and across the UK. And increasing the engagement of our community in our governance, in designing our services, in helping to deliver our neighbourhoods and our parents in the lead activities, will also support the sustainability of our programme and shift the balance of power in determining services for 0 to 3s, so that parents in the community have got a real voice in that. And that's really what our community engagement work is about. That's what our strategy is for, is to make that voice as important as all of the other voices in determining what support parents receive, what assets are built in their neighbourhoods to support them, and to bring the whole community around them, to make sure that everybody's on board with the mission of improving early childhood and improving children's outcomes through doing that. So our strategies underpins the work that we've been doing, and it's constantly under scrutiny by our board and by our local community, and we welcome that, because that helps us to get better and to do it right. Anyway, that's the sort of background to it. I'm going to pass on to Fiona now, and she's going to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in Better Start Bradford.
Thank you, Jill. So as you can imagine, our community engagement approaches have changed in response to COVID-19. So our engagement work, like so many of yours, is built through relationships, through group work, through one-to-ones, and through seeing people regular. So we have around 50 different groups that we go out to visit. So we've got 2 community engagement workers at the moment. We've got Hamera and Sally, and we go out to approximately 50 different groups in schools and in nurseries and community organisations, and work alongside them for a significant number of weeks. So that has just completely changed. We've also got 20 parents in the lead groups that are active, so we've had to look at how we continue to relate to them. So we've just had to turn things on the head and just do things completely different. So we've had to find new methods to interact with families. These methods have also been aligned to the district response. So we've been in contact with Zara's team, we've been in contact with public health, and also our neighbourhood partners and our voluntary sector organisations, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And the collaboration has been really strong. So we've worked with the community hubs, and particularly the neighbourhood centres to look at what we're learning. So we've developed something called an issues and responses log, and within that we've been looking at community need, we've been speaking to people, we've been asking, you know, what things have been affecting them during this period. And in response to that, you know, one of the things that people were saying is that they were really struggling to keep the children engaged and to fight boredom and so on. We had other people that had issues around digital inclusion. So in response to that, we got our heads together and we decided that we'd develop 1,000 children's activity packs. So we've probably had 30 different organisations that have worked with us to get those distributed. And within those packs, we've been able to share public health messaging and information from our projects as well. So that's been really interesting. I think the other work that we've done really has been around tailoring our work to specific family needs. So we have got some families where we've continued to have ongoing contact over the telephone over a number of weeks, and we've been offering like the befriending service, and that's particularly been the case for some of our neighbourhoods partners as well, particularly BD4 family. So we've found that there's been lots of issues that have been affecting our families, and I think those issues are like relatively similar across the district. But our main focus has been on looking at what the issues are for families with under 4s, and I won't read right through all these, but you can see, you know, people have needed support around welfare benefits, food parcels. You know, we've had families that have really been experiencing destitution, you know, and I heard in both Zara's presentation and in Pippa's that people were talking about the issues that were affecting some of the more marginalised groups in our Roma communities and Eastern European communities. So we've been very aware of some of that, but we've taken into account all these different issues, and we've just made sure that what we're doing is responsive to those issues. So just move on to our next slide, Jill. So we felt that within this, it's been really important to think about community readiness and to think about where our families are at. Pippa was talking earlier about hierarchy of need and about people having to serve the basic human needs before they could start to think about BSB key messages and accessing some of our programmes. So we've had to think about that, and we've just been mapping that as we've gone along. We've tried to really take a holistic approach to supporting families and to considering people's individual needs, and we've looked at the referral pathways into our projects. So what we've been trying to do is just make sure that everything's as simple as possible so that we can get families onto our projects. We've also used our community champions. So we've got, I think we've got 12 community champions now that have joined us. And we've developed like a two-way feedback loop, so the engagement team can speak to the champions, and we can learn about what the issues are and what are the sort of key messages that we need to share. And similarly, we've worked with our parents in the lead partners. So as I mentioned, we've got 20 active groups at the moment. You know, all of them are used to doing face-to-face work in the community. So we're having to look at how we're going to do this differently. So at the moment, what we're trying to do, as opposed to developing a lot of sort of new remote groups ourselves, what we're trying to do is support our parents in the lead groups to do that. And I know that that's been particularly successful in some of the work that BD4 Family have done. I think they've got 3 groups that are running at the moment. But also, you know, we know that we've had to look at the boundaries, you know, so we've not just worked in BD3 parts, BD4 and BD5, you know, we've looked at sort of wider family groups, and we've worked in the wider district as well. So in terms of evaluating what we've learned, it's been like an ongoing process really, and as I mentioned, we've used the issues and responses log. We've also been working with our community and neighbourhood partners, so we've moved to having like monthly update meetings with our neighbourhood partners, and that's been really interesting because what we've found is, although the issues are quite similar across the patch, you know, there's been specific things that our partners in BD5 have been able to talk to us about, and particularly our partners in Thornbury as well, telling us about some of the issues with the Roma community and the Eastern European community. We've shared what we've learned with our research partners at Born in Bradford, also with public health, so we've been working quite closely with Joe House, and we've shared information with the other ABS sites. So we've also developed what we call an insight publication, or a number of insight publications, which have just talked about how we've changed our practice during this period. And I think one of the next steps is for us to think about the redesign of our community engagement activities and the neighbourhood function as well. So then we have to move on to thinking what next, and we're not entirely sure really. I think like we're all in the same boat really, but what we do want to do is develop a post-COVID community engagement network, which will involve like many of our partners and hopefully some of you. We've mapped the 50 different groups that we usually work with that have been affected by COVID, and we want to start to just have a bit of a check-in from September and think about how we're going to do this differently. So we know that already, you know, some of our partners are running the holiday hunger provision over the summer, and they're moving to doing outdoor activities. So that's something that we need to consider. Likewise, our forest school partners are doing that. But we want to look at all the different models that have been adapted across the district. And within this, we will need to make sure that we're looking at our theory of change and that we're looking at our logic model, because what we need to ensure is that we're meeting the outcomes for children. Our activities need to link to that. So we will no doubt increase the remote offer to families and outdoor engagement, as I've mentioned, but there's also an opportunity to develop some of our Innovation Fund projects as well. So our Innovation Fund projects are about to go live. Some of them have actually been operating over the COVID period, in particular Horton Community Farm, and they were doing some work with the food distribution hubs and the neighbourhood centres where they've been giving out seed packs and things over the holidays. We're also developing an oral health project, and we're going to be working with our partners from September, hopefully doing some work in the nurseries and distributing some oral health packs and so on. And then we've also got a project that's going to be starting up at Women's Zone in BD3. So we're really looking forward to that. So that's going to be a community cafe and also a play gym. And I think finally, the other project that we're going to be looking at is around how we work with our grandparents. So we've got a project called Older Yet Wiser, which is going to be developed in the not too distant future as well. And some of our VCS partners are going to be involved in that. So interesting times, exciting times. You know, we've all learned from this, and we've all started to think about how we can do things differently and how we can still work in a really positive way to engage our community. So it gives me absolute pleasure now to introduce our final speaker, who is Ruth Abegbuna. So Ruth has had a successful teaching career in both Bradford and Manchester, and more recently she's founded the Roots programme. So she's been bringing together influencers from different communities to increase levels of compassion in our leaders. And listen to this, just listen to this one now. So Ruth was named by Virgin as one of the top 6 women change makers globally. I was telling my mum all about this this morning before I came in. And she's also been named by British Airways as one of their 100 modern Britons. So welcome, Ruth Abegbuna.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very, very lovely and embarrassing introduction, but it's really nice to be here, and I can see that there's 75 people listening at the moment, so my aim is to not have less than 70 by the time I end. The most important thing I think that I could bring to any of this is that I'm a very proud Bradfordian, and I'm very much working towards hoping for a kind of better new normal. I'm one of those who was very dissatisfied with the old normal. And my work has always been about how do we find those people who are furthest from power and feel that they're marginalised and don't have a voice, and how do we encourage those people to work with services and to feel that they've got parity in those conversations. I do a lot of work with young people, so a lot of the examples that I will share in terms of better engagement will be working with young people, but anything you can do with a young person, you can extrapolate to working with an adult in the community as well. A lot of my work has been in Manchester, a lot of my work has been in the valleys of Wales, and I'm very proud to be back in West Yorkshire, so I'm hoping that I can work with some of the fantastic people that I've been hearing from already this morning. The first slide is actually from a charity that I set up in Manchester called Reclaim. And this charity was very much, it was set in Moss Side, which a lot of people knew at the time was a very stigmatised community. And Moss Side was known for gun crime and gangs and lots of negative associations. And when I started working in the community and started teaching in the community, what I found there was a really vibrant community that was really distrustful of services and had been used and abused and consulted to death. They didn't want to have anyone else from local authority turning up to talk to them about anything, because they knew that their words may be twisted and that in actual fact they didn't feel that those consultations benefited themselves or their children. So we started work alongside the community to find young people in the community who wanted to exhibit leadership potential and to put them on a leadership training programme. As soon as we did this work, the presumption was the 50 black boys that we worked with were potential gang members. And so one of the ways that we worked really hard was how does a community reframe how it sees itself and force others to look at it the way that it sees itself. Moss Side didn't see itself in that way. So we worked with the community. We asked them, first of all, what were their priorities? What did those boys want from their lives? What did they want in their communities? And we had a really interesting consultation with local authority and the police who came down to meet the young people. And they came down very much with the prism of how can we deter gang violence in this area? And the young people were saying back to them, we want more bins, we want to tidy up our area. And I was just listening to this conversation and recognising that a lot of the adults who were in the room already knew what they wanted from that consultation. They wanted to talk about gang crime. And they were faced with 13 and 14-year-old boys who wanted to talk about bins. And it just struck me that it would have been so much more useful for all around if they dropped what they wanted to talk about and got those boys some bins. Because the very next time they arrived and wanted to talk about something that was perhaps more edgy, the boys would have listened. But the boys didn't talk to them about gang crime and the boys didn't get the bins. And I just thought to myself, what a waste of a consultation afternoon. So Reclaim was very much about leadership inequality. You can't talk about issues of COVID without really, really talking about inequality and talking about race and talking about the fact that there are certain people who are excluded from those conversations. So the rest of the presentation really is going to be how can we better talk to those people who are adversely affected and make them feel that they have been listened to and that things will change. So one of the things we used to do at Reclaim was we start off with a manifesto, and this is a word that's thrown around a lot, but we start off with a manifesto that was written by the young people, and it was their priorities. What did they want to work on in their own community? And the adults couldn't interfere. And what the Salford boys started off with, these are 13-year-old working class white boys, we said to them, what are your number one priorities for changing your community? This was in 2015. And we already had ideas of what we thought they would say. They didn't particularly like the police. They didn't particularly like their housing. So we thought that would be high on the list. What they came back with was they felt that their community was scapegoating immigrants who'd moved in, and they didn't like the level of racism that they were facing. And we were stunned and impressed, to be honest, but really, really stunned. These were 13-year-old boys. And because we were willing to just let them talk and listen and not steer the conversation, they took our programme to a completely different place. And I think that there's something in that in terms of, once we've got all this information about COVID, what are we doing with the communities? Are we going to them open-handed and saying, steer us through what you want to talk to us about, or are we going to deliver information to them? Because I think sometimes when you just go with an open ear, literally, and ask people to talk about their priorities, you can be very, very blown away by what they come back with. If anyone follows me on Twitter, they will have seen last night I asked this question about what terminology do people use for those who are furthest from power. And I always share this story because I went to an event, this was a few years ago, with a young guy from Moss Side, and I was asked to take some young people along, and the curator of the museum started talking about how they were doing really well with hard to reach audiences. And I'm sat there with working class 13-year-olds who had no idea what they were talking about. And one of the boys actually said to the room, what do you mean by hard to reach? Do you mean people like me? And the curator kind of, oh, this is very awkward, and said, well, yes. And the boy said, no, it's easy. You just get the 111 bus. It's like 4 stops away to get to Moss Side. Like, in all genuine trying to help out. So there's something in that, isn't there? Just in terms of people are very easy to reach. It's just a question of taking yourself into their community or a place where they feel comfortable. So much consultation will take place, and we've all been there, and some dry sandwiches will come around with some biscuits covered in cling film, and we'll all sit on chairs, and there'll be someone with, I don't know, a notepad with some set questions. There's usually some post-it notes. And, you know, we all go away at the end of it saying that was a great event. Was it? Could we have done it more in an interesting way? Could we have gone somewhere else? Could we have handed the agenda over to the communities and let them put something together? So I think there's just something in people aren't hard to reach. I started a Twitter thread off last night about this question, and it's still going now. I've had about 150 people respond with variations on hard to reach, but they're not hard to reach. We're just not doing it well enough. I often talk about this as well. I was a foster carer, and there were 2 social workers that used to work with my children, the 2 children I was looking after. One used to march in and have her conversations with the young people and get the information she needed and tell them about the lack of reviews. And she was very nice, and she'd have a coffee and she'd leave. And then they got a new social worker. And the very first meeting, she came in, took her shoes off, no piece of paper, noticed that my little 6-year-old had a T-shirt with Frozen on it, and sat down and asked them what they thought about the film and what they thought about the relationship between the 2 girls. And she said that she kind of blamed the older sister for what had happened. And my kids went crazy and were arguing with her completely about the depth of relationship between the sisters. And I was just watching the whole thing thinking, this is insane. And then she literally, after an hour of that, went. The point is, for the next 3 years, those girls loved that social worker because she was the first adult who'd engaged with them on something that they wanted to talk about. And for the rest of the meeting, she got everything she needed from them, because from that point onwards, they were willing to talk about what she wanted to talk about, because she'd shown them that she was interested in their real lives. And I think this is something that can be carried through to so many of the communities that we work with. Just entering and asking, what are your priorities? What do you care about? Not saying we're going to fix them, but just getting a true sense of what people feel. So in terms of the work that I do, we look at how to engage more powerfully. the first one I think is the most important. Asking questions, listening deeply, leaving to reflect, but the last word is the most important, return. So many consultations are one-off. You can't build a relationship, you can't get the depth you need, and also it leaves people feeling unsatisfied with that as an interaction. Go to them, engage with them, listen, leave and return. Even just to say what happened to that piece of consultation. Even with frustration to say it went nowhere, the funding didn't happen, we're really, really sorry, but we really appreciate your time. Always go back. Create the work together. So if we're talking about what a response is going to be to COVID, are we having these same conversations with these community groups? With parity, we're not telling them about what needs to be done, but asking them as well. Sharing power and sharing success. It's very easy when you're a lead in an authority or in a service. You've got all the power in that situation. How could you give some power to the other people in that room? How can you make yourself more vulnerable? And also, how can you ensure that if that work leads to a presentation elsewhere, or if you are praised for your work, or it leads to further funding, how often do we go back and tell the community that their small spark helped lead to something else? Leaving comfort zones. And that's not just physically going to other spaces, that's definitely doing something different, whether or not it's being prepared to go somewhere else, to eat different food, to let someone else create the agenda. One of the things we do a lot of the time is we ask our community groups to create the agenda, and we just say, give us a couple of slots on there, but the rest of it is up to you. That's quite a scary thing to do, to hand that over. The next one I'm very passionate about. And adult leading is never youth-led. I've seen so many examples of people talk about good youth work, and there's an adult who's led the project, and it's a project that an adult came up with in the first place. And then the adult's telling everyone at the end how successful it was. Where are the young people? That's not genuine consultation. So if an adult is leading a process of youth work, it's not youth-led. It could be good youth work, but it's not youth-led. And the last one for me is important. I think when we're doing consultation, we need to be honest with the groups about what success would look like, but what risk and failure would look like. What would be a successful project, but what would be something that we'd all feel disappointed with? How are we going to mitigate for risk and failure? And how are we going to move through that if we get to that point? I think there is something about the fact that sometimes you don't know where your work's going to take you when you get the engagement right. So this is work that we did with young people in Manchester, where we talked to them about the fact they wanted to create real change around stigma and stigma that working class communities face. And we said, what do you want to do? And they said, we want to have a rally in the city centre. At which point a lot of the adults became very, very nervous because, you know, that feels a bit out of our comfort zone and a bit out of control. But that's what the young people felt energised around. And so we worked behind the scenes to allow them to lead that work. We worked with the police, we worked with all the different agencies to ensure the work was done well. And the police marched with them quietly, supportively, and it was a huge success. We had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young people from across the city join. And that was something that we would never have anticipated. It was something that was driven by the young people, and they felt they owned it, so they felt very passionate about that change. And so that's something that now happens every single year in that city, is that the young people march through the city and they call for the change that they want to see. No kettling, no problems, no riots, just young people feeling that they've been seen and heard. I haven't got that long left, but I want to talk about something I feel very passionate about. And that is when we ascribe labels to groups of people that they haven't asked for. So I feel very, very strongly that I hate being called BAME. It's a word that means nothing to me. It doesn't describe me. It doesn't tell anyone anything about me, but it's quite often the box that I'm immediately put into. And so what happens is when I am called BAME, part of me just shuts off, because I think you haven't even been bothered enough to ask me if I'm comfortable with that label. So I really can't bother to engage with you. And what I think it also does is it allows me to be put in a box that keeps me out of the main room. And so often with the engagement that we're talking about, groups become marginalised, groups are kept on the periphery because either people are BAME or they're disabled or there's a mental health issue. And then the serious work goes on without them. And for me, COVID has shown the problems when groups like BAME are outside the room, when those who are making decisions about these marginalised groups don't look and feel and represent those people. With those people who've got the power and the money and the people who are deciding on strategy, if they don't involve everyone, bad decisions are made. So for me, there's something about being very careful about what we do with labels, because A, they might be labels that people are not comfortable with, and B, does that allow us to do pieces of work over there as opposed to ensure that those people are at the centre of our thinking and at the centre of what we're doing. I really like this quote from Banksy. He appeared with a piece of art during the Black Lives Matter, but this was actually his comment that I thought was actually very poignant, and exactly how, when I've spoken, especially to Black communities in Bradford, how they have felt that, if you look at the last sentence, no one will let them into the apartment upstairs. And there's something in that, in terms of what I was saying before. If you are a marginal group, quite often you are not in control and you don't feel you have any power. And for me, the better new normal that we should be pushing to post-COVID is ensuring that everyone feels that they've got a space at the main table. And the way you do that is by not just consulting with them, but inviting them in, inviting people in with humility and asking them what they truly feel and making sure that they feel seen and heard. And sometimes I think an acknowledgement of previous wrongs. We've all talked about the fact that inequality is an issue in COVID. That's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. And sometimes communities just need to hear that. And I think it will take a brave step to do that work, but that's the first stage in people feeling that they can work alongside authorities in partnership. Finally, people need to see people who look like them. And I've just included this photo because it was one that was taken back in, I think, 2007, with me working with girls in Moss Side. I think they were doing a fashion show. But what they saw was a 30-year-old woman who ran an organisation. And all of a sudden, it became very possible for them to believe that they could be at the table that I keep saying, because they saw someone like them with a background like them that's at the table. And just to end on a kind of hopeful, positive note, this is me celebrating one of those young people achieve her master's and the other one achieve her law degree. And that's me out of time. So thank you very much.
That's excellent, Ruth. Thank you for that. That was really good. I think you'll all join me in just giving a heartfelt thank you to all of our speakers this afternoon. I think it's been just an amazing experience and just so interesting and just so good to hear what the different issues are. There's a lot that's coming through on our chat, and all that will be addressed. Things around mental health and the impact of that, things around men being in a high-risk group and older people. Also, you know, some discussions in there around involvement with grassroots community groups and involving them more in decision making. A point made there, which I'm sure we're all, you know, we'll all agree with, is that many of the smaller groups have stepped up during COVID and become community anchors. So, you know, these are all things that we need to consider. And yeah, any further requests will be followed up. And I love what somebody said on there about keep it real. That's so good. Okay, so anyway, thank you. I've really enjoyed this, as you can probably tell, but thank you for your participation this afternoon. It's given us so much to think about, and it absolutely doesn't end there. As we know, there's so much going on across the district. There's so many more opportunities for involvement. Us here at Better Start will be developing a post-COVID community engagement network. So if that's something that interests you, then by all means get in contact. It won't just be for the Better Start Bradford area. I'm sure we're going to expand that to the wider district as well. So I'd just like to bring us to a close by thanking each and every one of our speakers, our panel members, you, the audience, and last but not least, those people that are behind the scenes that made the whole thing possible. So thank you to Zachary Yassin and also to Zebenezer Ahmed. So I think the only thing left for me to say now is thank you, stay safe, and goodbye.